God's table is one of plenty. God decides how much to give and gives more than we could ever imagine, more grace than we could ever expect. God even gives more than we would give ourselves. In the face of such abundance, we are called to be generous as God is generous. Indeed, at God's potluck of grace, even the last in line has more than enough to eat. Hear now what Jesus said in the Gospel of Matthew. Imagine those early Christians gathered at a table, reading these words to one another and remembering the words of Jesus.
Do you remember Do you remember the story that Jesus told to his disciples about the vineyard workers? God's kingdom is like an estate manager who went out early in the morning to hire workers for his vineyard, and they agreed on a wage of $1 a day and went to work.
Oh yeah, later about 9 o'clock, the manager saw some other men hanging around the town square unemployed. He told them to go to work in his vineyard, and he would pay them a fair wage. They went. He did the same thing at noon, and again at 3 o'clock, and again at 5 o'clock.
When the day's work was over, the owner of the vineyard instructed his foreman, "Call the workers in and pay them their wages. Start with the last hired and go on to the first." Those hired at 5 o'clock came up and were each given $1. When those who were hired first saw that, they assumed they would get far more. But they got the same, each of them $1. Taking the dollar, they groused angrily to the manager, "These last workers put in only 1 easy hour, and you just made them equal to us, who worked all day under a scorching sun."
He replied to one speaking for the rest, "Friend, I haven't been unfair. We agreed on the wage of $1, didn't we? So take it and go. I decided to give to the one who came last the same as you. Can't I do what I want with my own money? Are you going to get stingy because I am generous?" Here it is again, the great reversal, many of the first ending up last and the last first.
Hear, hear.
Thank you. Thank you, awesome readers. We appreciate your participation in leading us in thinking about a passage of Scripture maybe in a new way. And so this morning, I would like for you to take a little trip with me back down memory lane and think back to your childhood. Perhaps during your early school years, when you were in elementary school. Think of some things that children say, and after a moment, name what you think you might have said regularly when you were a child. Because when I think about my own childhood, and if I'm honest with you, 3 words come to my mind, and those 3 words are, "It's not fair." It's not fair that I have to do all the cleaning before Mom and Dad get home from work while my sisters just sit on the couch and watch TV. It's not fair that I have to spend more time on my schoolwork than my sisters do because I'm just not as smart as they are. It's not fair that I'm so fair-skinned that I blister and peel and can never get a tan. It's not fair that I inherited my dad's big nose. It's not fair. You can probably fill in the blank and finish that sentence just as well as I can, because if there's one thing we are all born with, it's the innate sense of fairness. And that's a powerful and wonderful thing, because that sense of fairness, when coming from a vantage point of maturity, is the foundation for justice and equality. It's not fair that someone can vote and others can't. It's not fair that some ride in the front of the bus while others have to sit in the back. It's not fair that some are paid more for the very same work. It's not fair that some go to bed hungry while others throw away so much food. Yes, our innate sense of fairness can lead to a strong and life-giving sense of justice. But not always, because our innate sense of fairness tends to be somewhat egocentric. In other words, we tend to think of fairness, as my examples from childhood memories demonstrate, in terms of what seems fair not only to me, but also for me. This morning, as John earlier said, we're concluding our sermon series, Come to the Table, by considering the power of God's grace that transforms our perceptions and our actions in a world that often isn't fair. As we prepare our hearts to hear God's message to us and for us this morning, I'd like to invite you now to join me to pray. Loving and gracious God, we give you our thanks this day for your presence in our lives and for your grace that is always enough and more. Bless our time together, O God, and may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be pleasing and acceptable in your sight. For you, O God, are our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Our scripture today from Matthew 20 is a parable that talks about fairness. And let's remember this, that the parables of Jesus may or may not be based on actual events, but rather are stories to help us think about deeper truths for what life in God's will and way calls us to. So as we look at this parable, it's important to recognize just how tough it was in the first century to be a day laborer, harder than it is for us today. There were folks without employment who had to stand in the town square hoping that some landowner needed extra work to be done and would hire them. And it's anyone's guess who actually got that opportunity. If you were healthy and lucky, you might be able to work 12 hours and feed your family. If you were unlucky and unhealthy, you'd most likely be passed over. But in this parable, Jesus tells us that everybody gets lucky. Some are chosen early, some are chosen late morning, at noon, at mid-afternoon, and just an hour before quitting time. No doubt these last folks were not just pleasantly surprised, but downright flabbergasted by their good fortune when they received a full day's wage for an hour of work. Now, it's important to keep in mind here, there's no indication these people had done something wrong. There was anything wrong with them at all. They had been there all day, the same as the others, ready, willing, and eager to work, but passed over time and again until right near the end. And in Jesus' parable, this act of incredible generosity sets up some expectations, right? When the landowner begins with those who had worked only an hour, the last ones who came on board, and they gives them the full day's wage, those who've been working longer hours began to do their mental calculating. Wouldn't you have done the same thing? And expectantly wanting and waiting for more than they had originally been promised. And to be honest, I don't blame them one iota for that. Do you? After all, these folks who'd worked just 1 hour got a full day's wage. Wouldn't it only be fair to give those who'd worked 12 long hours a little more, or maybe a lot more? But that's not what happens. They receive a full day's wage, nothing more and nothing less, just as they had been promised. And when this happens, we're told, or maybe we can imagine, that they're confused, disappointed, probably a little bit angry too, because that just doesn't seem fair. But the landowner reminds them that in fact it is totally fair. They are paid what was promised. And so why do they begrudge the landowner's generosity? It's a good question. And that's what parables are supposed to do. They often lead us to lots of questions, especially when they seem to push back against our way of looking at a fair world. Because so often, rather than assessing our lives through the abundance we have been given by God, we focus our attention on what we lack. Rather than feeling fortunate to have found work for the day, the workers that have been working for 12 hours feel unfortunate at not having received more. And rather than rejoicing that these other workers who'd waited all day for the prospect of work can return home blessed and be able to feed their families, they only begrudge them because maybe they even curse them for their good luck. So part of the parable is to illustrate the hardness of heart by those who consider themselves righteous over and against those who don't think deserve God's grace and mercy. But there's also something about this parable that speaks to us as to our own day and to our own lives as it ever did to Jesus' original audience. Because this parable lays before each and every one of us a choice as clear as it can be. And that choice is this. When we look at our lives, do we count our blessings or our misfortunes? Let me say that again. When we look at our lives, do we count our blessings or our misfortunes? Do we pay attention to the areas of plenty in our lives, or do we perceive what we lack? Do we live by gratitude or by envy? You see, the hard thing about this choice is that it really is a choice. Because here's an uncomfortable truth. You and I cannot be grateful and envious at the same time. You can't be grateful and envious at the same time. The table of grace. God offers it to us every single day of our lives. But here's the thing. Do we even recognize it? I have a quote in my office by Keanu Reeves that says this: "The simple act of paying attention can take you a long way." Pay attention. And one of the things that I'm learning over time, especially when I'm feeling envy or I'm holding a grudge or I'm having some kind of resentment or unforgiveness in my life, is the necessity to stop and to pay attention so that God can show me where I'm missing the mark. Sometimes that happens as I stop and I take a prayer breath when I'm anxious or angry. Sometimes it's in the middle of the night when I'm being still and I'm not so distracted by other things. And sometimes it's when I get away to an unfamiliar place so that I get to see more clearly God's grace. And speaking of getting away to a place that's different, I want to invite Drew and Ben to come forward and share some of their experiences that they had when they went to Nicaragua this past month. So I'm going to invite them to come up and to answer the question, where do you see God's grace? So come on up.
We're standing here.
We're going to stand here and share a microphone. We were, a few weeks ago, Ben and I got a chance to go to Matagalpa, Nicaragua, and we were hosted by Rayo del Sol. And so a few slides from our trip, and we'll talk about them as they go through. This is in front of a library, and the kids just got shoes and school supplies. And they're being taught how to garden so they can raise their own vegetables. This is more of in the country. That's a woman who receives care. She lives more in the city part, one room, dirt floor, metal walls. That's a hospital or a makeshift.
It's basically a health clinic they set up out in the country, and they're going through, and each person is getting checked out. Rayo del Sol, I was really amazed by the scope of their services. They employ a full-time doctor, full-time nurse. There's the nurse on this slide here. They employ social workers, education people, and agricultural people. And it's amazing just the services they go through. There's the little boys digging in on the garden right there. So they are really doing a lot out in the community, and they just go out and kind of meet people where they're at. I think this next slide was, okay, there's the, that's a common road out in the country. So you can see that is, that's a pretty rough road. That's the gate to the schoolhouse.
You need a
that we're
4x4. Anywhere
Yeah.
you go, you need a 4x4.
That's the school, one of the schools. And that's where the kids get their education. And that's talking about meeting people where we're at. That is down a road in the city. On houses, there's houses on either side of that road. There's houses on either side of that road. And one thing, if I move to Nicaragua and pursue a career, it's going to be a barbed wire salesman. Because there is barbed wire everywhere. So if you go to trip, you don't want to reach to the fence. Go ahead, Drew.
That's an abandoned school that was built years ago by the government that Rayo is hoping to eventually move into. They have contracts with the government to do that, but that's your bathroom
For the school.
for the school.
For the school.
And they're lucky to have it. A lot of places didn't have outdoor facilities. You've heard about the rain barrels that Rayo del Sol has put up. That's one of them. It's dry. You have rainy season and dry season. You don't have summer and winter. So during the dry season, that's very important to have water. A lot of times, that's the only potable water that's available. That's another person receives care. That's her kitchen.
Well, yeah, that's the smokeless stove. So most people are cooking over open wood. And they breathe that smoke in. It's actually in their house. That roof was black from before she got the smokeless stove. And Rayo purchases those off a company in Managua for $250 each and puts them out in people's houses that need to have, don't want to breathe smoke anymore, basically while they cook. So it's much healthier. It consumes less wood. Deforestation is a huge problem there. They're running out of woods just because that's what they use to cook over. But this limits the consumption. Go ahead, Drew.
And that's a classroom set up in a church in the country. The families, they walk, it seems like miles, a lot to come to these events. It is amazing. Women are carrying their children, walking down those roads. This event would happen maybe once a week, maybe twice a week.
Now, this was the Young Life group, wasn't it? I think this was
so.
the Young Life group that was there.
We were there over Valentine's Day, so if you can't say the 3 words "I love you" to people in Spanish, it's a lot easier. It's just 2 words, "Te amo." So St. Valentine's Day it's a big holiday in the community, so they had an event for the community.
I think this is the most important photo that Drew took the entire time. This little boy didn't want to come inside. And that's Peter kneeling down, talking to him, meeting him where he was, the same way Jesus meets us where we're at. And after talking to the little boy a little bit, he eventually got up and came in and joined the rest of the group with the celebration. So, and I think that's what the mission there is about, is meeting people where they're at. I think that's a lot of our church's mission here in the community we're in, is meeting people where they're at.
And to talk about grace, we went there. I don't know what you expected, Ben, but I'd seen pictures, so I kind of expected some of what we saw. But when we got there, I expected dirt roads. I expected people to be living on much less than we live on in the United States. I expected that. What I did not expect was the people that I ran into. despite these conditions. In America, people say we're born on third base, and then we celebrate when we get to home plate, right? You're like, woohoo! But a lot of the rest of the world is not born on third base. They're not maybe even born at home plate to begin with. They're still in the dugout, and they still have to make their way around the bases, to use a metaphor. But not once did I hear someone say it's not fair that I live this life. It's not fair that you come from another country with a lot more resources available to you. I heard over and over again how grateful people were for each day, for any opportunity, whether it's education. They didn't, to walk those roads, that was just the way it was. And they were grateful that they had a place to go for school when it was in session, and that they had food on their table every day. Didn't matter that it was a wood stove.
Grateful for having a latrine that Rayo de Sol put in, an outside latrine,
and
because they didn't have one before.
And they were proud. Everyone I met was proud of what they were doing and their accomplishments. They have the same hopes and dreams and goals as the rest of us, to have a better life for their kids, to have a loving community and family around to live in. And in all of this, what I came to understand is that their faith carries them through a lot of it. And having that faith demonstrated day after day after day, in a lot of ways, what I learned from this is that their faith is maybe stronger than my faith, or a lot of other people's faiths that I know, when really you might think, because of all the blessings,
There wasn't,
it might be the
there
other way
wasn't
around.
woe is me.
It wasn't.
There no woe is me. There wasn't a victim mentality. We're doing this, we're getting through this, and thanks for the help that Rayo de Sol is providing.
Yeah, so I knew going into this in my head, because I've traveled a little bit, that as we meet people, we're more alike than we are different, right? But after this experience, I also now know in my heart. And that's the difference.